right now. That's what we'll look at. And so reflecting on that and taking the time to recognize it, just to acknowledge it. That's what we're going to look at today, the goodness of God. And I'll tell you what I was inspired by to bring this today, because it's true every day, yeah? If we're mindful of it. So many times the day just goes by and we're focused on other things and we forget it's the goodness of God that we're even here. It's the goodness of God if we can stand up, if we can get out of bed, and even if we can't. It doesn't change His goodness. So we've seen close-ups of what it looks like in the lives of at least two important people this past week. I think you know who I mean. Let's just take a look at where we were yesterday. Here's Dorothy, one of the pictures that was in the collage that we saw. And so today I want to devote similar attention to someone Dorothy shared much in common with. Another person I voted for twice and have always admired, former President Jimmy Carter. I don't know if any of you or she voted for him or not. It doesn't really matter. But the two of them had much in common, and that's what I want to connect with the goodness of God today. Yes, what do they have in common? Yes, they're both giving gestures of openness. They're waving. They're smiling. Those are open gestures, are they not? So much so. The fitting gestures that we said our goodbyes to this past week, one a widow and the other a widower, both having lost loved ones in their lives. You might notice Jimmy's looks like he's got a black eye, huh? And a bandage. We'll get to have a closer look at that. I'm classifying them as two heroic followers of Christ. Ever faithful, ever giving, ever hopeful. What we saw and heard of them, about them, is what it means to leave a lasting legacy for the next generation. Jesus told Peter he was giving him the keys to the kingdom. And what we bind on earth will be bound in heaven. So the way we live down here matters. I wanted to add these pieces here, these extra thoughts and words to these two heroic followers of Christ. Ever faithful, ever giving, ever hopeful, ever grateful, ever positive, ever loving, always respectful of others, and ever mindful of living a life pleasing to God. I was inspired to open with that song, or not to open, but to have that song, Goodness of God, lead into this message today. As I watched a video, or as I caught portions at least of a video of President Carter's funeral. It had many stops along the way because there were many places that were important to his life, starting with the simplest of origins. And we saw him, follow the trip the rest of the distance to his final resting place. So I am giving myself a little, there's a song, Let My Words Be Few. That's where I'm coming from. And so we're gonna have some video pieces in here. Just watch them closely. Hear them. Let them enter into your heart and see in them the goodness of God spoken through people memorializing Jimmy Carter. This is his grandson, Jason Carter. And he says in here, from the moment he woke up until he lay his head, Grandpa's life was a testimony, a testament to the goodness of God.
In my church, we sing a song that says, From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. I don't know how many people in here can say that. I know I can't. But my grandfather certainly can. From the moment that he woke up until he laid his head, his life was a testament to the goodness of God. And I thank all of you for being here to celebrate this life. To the presidents and first ladies, it is a great honor to have you here. You know the human side of the American presidency like no others, and we appreciate you. To the vice presidents, other distinguished guests, and friends of all kinds, thank you for being here. To those of you who came from all across the world, thank you for being here to celebrate and pay tribute to my grandfather. I say grandfather, but we called him Papa, as many of you know. We called my grandmother Mom Carter, so we spent our time talking about Mom and Papa, and mostly, speaking of the human side of the presidency, just letting people know that they were regular folks. Yes, they spent 4 years in the governor's mansion and 4 years at the White House, but the other 92 years they spent at home in Plains, Georgia. And one of the best ways to demonstrate that they were regular folks is to take them by that home. First of all, it looks like they might have built it themselves. Second of all, my grandfather was likely to show up at the door in some 70s short shorts and Crocs. And then you'd walk in the house and it was like thousands of other grandparents' house all across the South. Fishing trophies on the walls. The refrigerator, of course, was papered with pictures of grandchildren and then great-grandchildren. Their main phone, of course, had a cord and was stuck to the wall in the kitchen, like a museum piece. And demonstrating their Depression-era roots, they had a little rack next to the sink where they would hang Ziploc bags to dry. And demonstrating that they changed with the times, eventually he did get a cell phone, and one time he called me sort of early on in that process. And on my phone it said, Papa Mobile. So I answered it, of course. I said, hey, Papa. He said, who's this? I said, this is Jason. He said, what are you doing? I said, I'm not doing anything. You called me. He said, I didn't call you. I'm taking a picture. Nuclear engineer, right? I mean, they were small town people who never forgot who they were and where they were from, no matter what happened in their lives. But I recognize that we are not here because he was just a regular guy. As you've heard from the other speakers, his political life and his presidency for me was not just ahead of its time, it was prophetic. He had the courage and strength to stick to his principles even when they were politically unpopular. As governor of Georgia half a century ago, he preached an end to racial discrimination and an end to mass incarceration. As president in the 1970s, as you've heard, he protected more land than any other president in history. 50 years ago, he was a climate warrior who pushed for a world where we conserved energy, limited emissions, and traded our reliance on fossil fuels for expanded renewable sources. And by the way, he cut the deficit, wanted to decriminalize marijuana, deregulated so many industries that he gave us cheap flights and, as you heard, craft beer. Basically, all of those years ago, he was the first millennial. And he could make great playlists, as we've heard as well. Maybe this is unbelievable to you, but in my 49 years, I never perceived a difference between his public face and his private one. He was the same person no matter who he was with or where he was. And for me, that's the definition of integrity. That honesty was matched by love, it was matched by faith, and in both public and private, my grandparents did fundamentally live their lives in an effort, as the Bible says, to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with their God. Sometimes I feel and felt like I shared my grandfather with the world. Today is one of those days. But really, he shared the world with me. The power of an atom, the beauty and complexity of a South Georgia forest. When we fished, he celebrated the majesty of everything from the smallest minnow to that grand circulation of waters. And he shared this love with my boys, taking these Atlanta public school kids out into the fields to show them about row crops and wild plums. In the end, his life is a love story. And of course, it's a love story about Jimmy and Rosalind and their 77 years of marriage and service. As the song says, they were the flagship of the fleet. And rest assured that in these last weeks, he told us that he was ready to see her again. But his life was also a broader love story, about love for his fellow humans and about living out the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. I believe that love is what taught him and told him to preach the power of human rights, not just for some people, but for all people. It focused him on the power and the promise of democracy, its love for freedom, its requirement and founding belief in the wisdom of regular people raising their voices, and the requirement that you respect all of those voices, not just some. That conviction made him a naval officer who believed and demonstrated, as you've heard, that the greatest power of America was not the military, but its values. And those values were personal to him, and he lived them both publicly and privately. As you heard Stu say, as president, he gave voice to dissidents, stood up to dictators, brought countries together in peace. His heart broke for the people of Israel. It broke for the people of Palestine, and he spent his life trying to bring peace to that holy land. And he talked about it at the dinner table. It was the same in public as it was in private. And for the last 40 years, as you've heard, he spent his time living out that love and that faith alongside the poorest and most marginalized people in the world. And that work, again, has been based fundamentally on love and respect. The Carter Center has 3,500 employees, but only a couple hundred in the United States. The rest are spread throughout the countries where we work: Ethiopia, South Sudan, Chad, Bangladesh, and all of the Carter Center's programs are based on a respect, that same respect for the power of regular people, even if they are in tiny villages miles from anywhere else. To give one example, we've all heard a lot lately about guinea worm disease. It's an ancient and debilitating disease of poverty, and that disease will have existed from the dawn of humanity until Jimmy Carter. When he started working on this disease, there were 3.5 million cases in humans every year. Last year, there were 14. And the thing that's remarkable is that this disease is not eliminated with medicine. It's eliminated essentially by neighbors talking to neighbors about how to collect water in the poorest and most marginalized villages in the world. And those neighbors truly were my grandfather's partners for the last 40 years. And as this disease has been eliminated in every village in Nigeria, every village in Sudan or Uganda, what's left behind in those tiny 600-person villages is an army of Jimmy and Rosalind Carters who have demonstrated their own power to change their world. And that is a fundamental truth about my grandfather. It begins where it ends. When he saw a tiny 600-person village that everybody else thinks of as poor, he recognized it. That's where he was from. That's who he was. And he never saw it as a place to send pity. It was always a place to find partnership and power and a place to carry out that commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Essentially, he eradicated a disease with love and respect. He waged peace with love and respect. He led this nation with love and respect. To me, this life was a love story from the moment that he woke up until he laid his head. I'll conclude with this. As Andy Young told me, he may be gone, but he's not gone far. The outpouring of love and support that we have felt from you and from around the world shows how many lives he has touched and how his spirit will live on in many ways for us. He'll be in the kitchen making pancakes, or in his wood shop finishing a cradle for a great-grandchild, or standing in a trout stream with Mom Carter, or for me, just walking those Georgia fields and forests where he's from. Thank you.
I hope that was as... He talked about a legacy. And I want us to be thinking about the legacy that we hold in our hands, that we live day to day. What that looks like, what it will look like, what will be said about us, how we will be remembered. So live your life to pass on a lasting legacy of knowing the goodness of God. Passing this legacy key on is like forwarding our own hope of becoming part of that great cloud of witnesses, cheering others on. Maybe you imagine heaven to be the ultimate pain-free retirement. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that's what God has in mind. I think he has things for us to be very much engaged in, involved with. The song said, "With every breath I will sing of the goodness of God." That's what we pass on to them when we pay it forward while we're still alive, while we share our faith in word and in action. Shakespeare is quoted as saying, "No legacy is so rich as honesty." In Proverbs 11:3 says this, "The integrity of the upright will guide them, but the falseness of the treacherous will destroy them." There's two paths, right? There's that narrow path that leads to life, and there's that broad way that leads to destruction. We're talking about integrity. We're talking about honesty, which is a key component of it. We're talking about truth, and so we get guidance on how to handle the truth. Paul tells us that instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head. That is Christ. We're going to move on now to a eulogy that Gerald Ford, no longer alive, right? A eulogy that Gerald Ford wrote for Jimmy Carter that his son will read.
Before I start, the Carter children, my wife and I were sitting several rows behind you, and We were praying for you, and I was humbly reminded that it was 18 years ago, almost to the day, that our family sat in that very row and supporting my mom, and it was your dad and his great faith that supported my mom and gave her hope that week. He traveled with us for several days, and we were blessed. So thank you. God did a good thing when he made your dad. Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, Mr. President, Madam Vice President, former presidents, first ladies, members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, justices of the Supreme Court, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. In the twilight of my dad's life, Dad and President Carter spoke by phone, and Dad asked President Carter if he would do a eulogy at Dad's funeral. President Carter graciously agreed, and then he also asked if Dad would deliver a eulogy at President Carter's funeral. Now, Dad was thrilled to agree. After that call, as you can imagine, both of them got off the phone and had a pretty good chuckle, considering which one of them would return in person to deliver that second eulogy. As you know, Dad died in 2006, and President Carter's eulogy continues to bring comfort, smile, laughter, joy, pride to our family. And thus, on behalf of my dad, it's an honor to share Dad's eulogy to his old friend. I can just see my dad getting his yellow legal pad out with his pen and writing this for his beloved friend. By fate of a brief season, Jimmy Carter and I were rivals. But for the many wonderful years that followed, friendship bonded us as no two presidents since John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. It is said that President Adams' last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." Now, since Jimmy has a good decade on me, I'm hedging my bets by entrusting my remembrances of Jimmy to my son, Steve. According to a map, it's a long way between Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Plains, Georgia. But distances have a way of vanishing when measured in values rather than miles. And it was because of our shared values that Jimmy and I respected each other as adversaries, even before we cherished one another as dear friends. Now, this is not to say that Jimmy never got under my skin, but has there ever been a group of politicians that didn't do that to one another? During our 1976 contest, Jimmy knew my political vulnerabilities, and he successfully pointed them out. Now, I didn't like it, but little could I know that the outcome of that 1976 election would bring about one of my deepest and most enduring friendships. In the summer of 1981, the two of us found ourselves together again, this time aboard Air Force One, bound for the funeral of the great peacemaker Anwar Sadat. There's an old line to the effect that two presidents in a room is one too many. Frankly, I wondered how awkward that long flight might be to Cairo, and it was a long flight, but the return trip was not nearly long enough, for it was somewhere over the Atlantic that Jimmy and I forged a friendship that transcends politics. We immediately decided to exercise one of the privileges of a former president, forgetting that either one of us had ever said any harsh words about the other one in the heat of battle. Then we got on to much more enjoyable subjects, discussing our families, our faith, and sharing our experiences in discovering that there is indeed life after the White House. We commiserated over the high cost of building presidential libraries and the even more regrettable fact that most of that fundraising for these otherwise admirable institutions fell to us personally. On the spot, we agreed to participate in programs at each other's library, beginning with a series of conferences on arms control. And if that wasn't newsworthy enough, we told reporters on the plane that a lasting Middle East peace would require the United States to make tough decisions, like confronting the Palestinian issue directly, thereby building on the work to which President Sadat had literally given his life. It was the first time, but by no means the last time, that our unlikely partnership ruffled feathers in the Washington establishment. Now, honesty and truth-telling were synonymous with the name Jimmy Carter. Those traits were instilled in him by his loving parents, Lillian and Earl Carter, and the strength of his honesty was reinforced by his upbringing in the rural South, poised on the brink of social transformation. He displayed that honesty throughout his life as a naval officer, state legislator, governor, president, and world leader. For Jimmy Carter, honesty was not an aspirational goal, it was part of his very soul. Now, I think Jimmy wrote more books than any former president. Once asked if he really enjoyed writing, he replied with that familiar twinkle in his eye, "It beats picking cotton." But I think he enjoyed writing for another reason. As an author, he was under no pressure to tailor his opinions to some political constituency or potential contributor. Now, both of us had experienced the harsh reality that defeat at the polls can be painful, but we also came to know a more important consequence. Political defeat and writing can also be liberating. If it frees you to discuss topics that aren't necessarily consistent with short-term political popularity. Now, Jimmy learned early on that it was not enough merely to bear witness in a pew on a Sunday morning. Inspired by his faith, he pursued brotherhood across boundaries of nationhood, across boundaries of tradition, across boundaries of caste. In America's urban neighborhoods and in rural villages around the world, he reminded us that Christ had been a carpenter. And in third world villages, he successfully campaigned not for votes, but for the eradication of diseases that shame the developed world as they ravage the undeveloped one. Now, of course, not all of Jimmy's time was spent building houses, eradicating disease, brokering ceasefires, monitoring elections. While Jimmy is probably the only former president to conduct a weekly Bible class, I know for certain he's the only former president to perform a duet of On the Road Again with Willie Nelson. Georgia wasn't just on Jimmy's mind, it was in his blood. However far he traveled, he never forgot where he came home to, or where now, in the end, he would finally come home to. Of the many things Jimmy and I had in common, the most important is this. We both married way above ourselves, way above. With Jimmy, every step of the way was his first lady from Plains. In a life rich with blessings, none was greater for Jimmy than the love he shared with Rosalind and the love the two of them shared with their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Like Jimmy, Rosalind was and is a symbol of American compassion. Like no other First Lady in our history, Rosalind Carter is indeed a true citizen of the world. And she became a beloved friend to my wife Betty and me and to all the Ford family. While the Carter and Ford men were decidedly mixed record when it came to lobbying Congress, Rosalind and Betty were unbeatable in their advocacy for millions of people whom they brought out of the shadows of despair and shame. Now is a time to say goodbye, our grief comforted with the joy and the thanksgiving of knowing this man, this beloved man, this very special man. He was given the gift of years, and the American people and the people of the world will be forever blessed by his decades of good works. Jimmy Carter's legacy of peace and compassion will remain unique as it is timeless. The entire Ford family, we extend our love to you, and we add our prayers to the prayers of tens of millions of people around the world. May God bless and watch over this good man. May he grant peace to the Carter family as they say goodbye to a man whose life was lived to the fullest, with a faith demonstrated in countless good works, with a mission richly fulfilled, and a soul rewarded with everlasting life. As for myself, Jimmy, I'm looking forward to our reunion. We have much to catch up on. Thank you, Mr. President. Welcome home, old friend.
You know, when you listen to these, you hear many words that are part of a believer's vocabulary, don't you? It's refreshing. It's refreshing, and it's not just fake lip service. It's the real thing. That's what we've been seeing here. I feel a cold draft, and I just don't know. Anybody else feel that? Where is that coming from? I think, does that say heat, or does it say cool on it? Yeah, well, that's this big vaulted ceiling with no insulation. It'll always be on and off again. Did you just turn that off, Nance? Okay, all right. So back to where we were. Leaving a legacy means rising to meet the challenge and persevering through pain. Jimmy Carter, an American hero, ever faithful, ever giving, and ever positive. We're going to look at that. We're going to get to see why the black eye and the stitches here. 14 stitches, a black eye, and a large bandage are no match for former President Jimmy Carter, who turned 95 last week, this written in October 2019. Just hours after suffering injuries from a fall in his home Sunday morning, Carter traveled to Nashville to kick off a week of volunteer work. He says, I fell down and hit my forehead on a sharp edge and had to go to the hospital. I've been there twice. And they put 14 stitches in my forehead and my eye is black, as you have noticed, he said. But I had a number one priority, and that was to come to Nashville and build houses. David Letterman has some things to remember Jimmy with. Let's hear what he has to say.
In my life, I have always struggled and envied people who have figured out a way to make a difference in the world. People who know how, as we like to say, move the needle. I would not have known to call Habitat for Humanity if it wasn't for President Carter and Rosalind Carter. It's because of these two people that my friends and I were able to find a way to help in a very, very small way. "35 years. You know what I did for 35 years? I talked to celebrities. Every damn day, I'd put on makeup and talk to movie stars. That's how I move the needle, ladies and gentlemen, and I couldn't be more proud. So it's with tremendous envy that I am blessed to be here today with the President and his wife, because they have become in their lives a beacon to show you what needs to be done and how it can be done. And I'm telling you, if it weren't for them, I'd still be sitting on my couch watching cable news. They've changed my life, the lives of my friends, and the people who we helped back into homes.
God bless you, David. Back to Habitat for Humanity and Jimmy, who's got a bandage and a black eye. Jimmy Carter, the oldest living former U.S. president, and his wife, Rosalind Carter, have been working on building new porches on 21 Nashville homes that week. The funds raised by the Carter Work Project will allow an additional 12 new single-family homes and 26 new townhomes to be built by the nonprofit by 2021. Jimmy wasn't a bystander. Don't you want to be remembered that way? Because you were like that? This is a good point for me to acknowledge the many hands-on workers and contributors to what we do and enjoy as a family life of ABC, in the family life of ABC. Not just here, but the many ways we support people, ministries, and agencies working on the front lines here and around the world. Weaving in with this, I just want to give a special mention, as I have not long ago with others, that Hospice of Santa Cruz is just one of the agencies. Just one of the agencies, because I think it's very relevant to our age group. Jimmy Carter was in hospice for 2 years. It's not only a caregiver for the person, it's a helping hand to the family, helping them to navigate through this very, very difficult time of transition and administer medications and deal with the very difficult part. So, when you give to the church, that's one of the ministries you're supporting. David Letterman got it. Jimmy and Rosalind were lifelong partners, 77 years together, committed to making the world a better, more humane place without prejudice or self-glorification. I'm confident the Lord will say, "Well done, my good and faithful servants. Come on in to spend the time you look forward to and rest with me." Always smiling. They've worked alongside 103,000 volunteers, worked alongside of them in 14 countries, including India, South Korea, and the Philippines. Hands-on people. And with that, I switch gears here a bit to, that has been a big piece of the news cycle, but then it's set aside because of the massive fires in Southern California. Beyond imagination. Does anyone have family in the area? I see hands. People affected in a very real and terrible way. Unimaginable. Schools, hospitals, businesses, homes. Not only the most wealthy, but regular people. One guy that was interviewed lived in a mobile home, in a mobile home park. It was an older mobile home, and one of those you can't get insurance for. Gone. Everything gone. Others may find that their insurance wasn't adequate or wasn't what it needed to be to even give them the hope as they pick through the ashes of everything lost. So we need to remember praying for and giving financial support to victims of the devastating firestorms in LA County. You know, when it's over there, it's like it's over there. I'm so glad it's not over here. But I always go back to remembering the '89 earthquake when it was right here. And just a few years ago when we couldn't open the windows for smoke because it was nearby. Just over there, all around us. We may very well have our turn. And I think that God will recognize, even if it doesn't make a gigantic difference in any big way to help them, what we give from the heart matters. I saw on television that the Red Cross was giving a way to support the efforts, and right away I thought of, well, what about our association? Because they were promoting giving to the flood victims in North Carolina. And the reason I like to work through our association is that they have people on the ground, believers on the ground that can give the hands-on physical help, but also the spiritual and emotional support for maybe someone who did not yet even have a place for God. But now in this desperate moment, and they see the love of Christ coming through people who are supposed to be a light. And that doesn't have to be just those people over there. That is us too, huh? So I intend to find out where we can give most needed, best applied, and be part of making a difference there, and I hope you will too. Leaving a legacy means learning to preserve what matters most. I say learning because I didn't come with this knowledge. In fact, I still am a work in progress. I hope it's progressing there. And so let's take a look at something else. Because this slide is for me. This particular set is for me. Marriage tips from a love story that spanned more than 7 decades. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter married in 1946, 77 years. That's their wedding picture, going off, leaving the chapel where they were married. So I'm going to play a little interview or a little piece that was put together. And there's one point in there at the very beginning where Jimmy is saying something that's very difficult to understand. So if you don't understand it, it's not just your hearing, it's the way he was talking.
I A love story that spanned more than 7 decades. Former President Jimmy Carter and First Lady Rosalind Carter, who were the longest married first couple, surpassed 77 years of marriage.
I can't believe.
Both growing up in Plains, Georgia, the Carters went on their first date back in 1945. Though Rosalind initially rejected the first proposal, the couple tied the knot on July 7, 1946. Their love seeing them through raising 4 children, a presidential term, running the family farm supply business, humanitarian work around the world, and a cancer diagnosis. From sharing a kiss on the presidential debate stage to a smooch on the kiss cam at a 2019 NBA game. The relationship wasn't without tribulations, though. The couple reflecting on writing a book together on Today.
We really did have a terrible time writing the book.
We thought perhaps the last chapter would be about our divorce.
Former Carter White House Communications Director Jerry Rafshoon in 2021, reflecting on how they worked together as a team.
They treat each other as equals, and they always have.
The 39th president also sharing this marriage advice with Judy Woodruff on PBS.
We make up and give each other a kiss before we go to sleep.
The Carters celebrated their 75-year milestone anniversary together in their hometown of Plains, Georgia.
And to my wife, Rosen, I want to express a particular gratitude for being the right woman that I chose for my wife. Thank you.
Last year, the former First Lady passed away at the age of 96. Carter coming out of hospice care at home to bid her goodbye. His daughter, Amy Carter, spoke on his behalf, reading from a love letter he wrote to Mrs. Carter while serving in the Navy.
Every time I have ever been away from you, I have been thrilled when I returned to discover just how wonderful you are.
Just an incredible love story, Andrea. Rosalind was Jimmy Carter's partner in love, his partner in life, but in so many ways, she was also his partner in politics, too.
Absolutely, that's certainly right. She attended cabinet meetings, key briefings, even spoke on behalf of the White House during ceremonial gatherings. Rosalind became a champion of mental health care, creating community centers across the nation. Together, the Carters created the Carter Center, improving global health in Africa, elsewhere around the globe, and monitoring elections, promoting human rights. In everything, Harry, they were partners. They were soulmates for life.
Andrea Mitchell.
Hi, I'm Peter.
Thank you so much for those remembrances.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't miss the Today Show every weekday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 Pacific on our show.
Remembering President Carter. So much has been said about him, following on the heels of our own thoughts and words, and people speaking of Dorothy. In my mind, they were truly historic. These were truly historic events, and we remember them with great love. Leaving a legacy means, if you don't get a miracle, the goodness of God proves you can become one. You know Nick Wojcik, born without arms, legs. Way less limited than me. If you don't get a miracle, become one. And the question then for all of us, are you going to finish strong? It's a quote by Nick Wojcik. Are you going to finish strong? Or just fade away? I want to apply some of God's word to this, and then we'll be done here. In Philippians 2:12 through 13, the Apostle Paul says this, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you've always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." Another translation of that, which I think is a good one also, obeying God with deep reverence and fear. For God is working in you, giving you the desire and the power to do what pleases Him. Peter says this, "For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with patient endurance, and patient endurance with godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love for everyone. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ." We can have lots of knowledge of Jesus. We can have Bible studies, we can do all kinds of things, but be ineffective and unproductive. I don't think that's what God has in mind when He says, "Come on in, good and faithful." And so I want to call this Mission Possible. And the way Mission Impossible would do it, there would be a little instruction giving them some brief things before it would dissolve. And so it would say, should you accept your mission and calling, I say to you, to live a life pleasing to God, because you know you have been chosen by Him, for His good pleasure and purpose. Paul again says in Romans 8:29, "For God knew His people in advance, and He chose them to become like His Son, so that His Son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And having chosen them, He called them and us to come to Him, and having called us, He gave us right standing with Himself. And having given us right standing, He gives us His glory." What shall we say about such wonderful things as these? If God is with us, who can ever be against us? We're going to receive the offering now. And I put this for us to ponder as we take that. And I'll just say these words. Dear Lord, as a prayer, when the offering basket comes around, let my contribution be like the widow who put in all she had to live on. Let my contribution not be the very least I can do,